Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. So I said that I would do just a short little video for you just to sum up some of the things related to the Paris Peace Conference. And as we mentioned in class this morning, this is really the full name for the peace conference that includes the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles is the treaty specific to the Allies and Germany. And then there's other treaties that are decided also at the Paris Peace Conference to end the war technically with Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Turkey, and so on. So we can see here that there's about 32 countries that attend the Paris Peace Conference, and this is just an image that shows you a little bit of the big four. So Britain, France, Italy, the United States, of course. The United States, of course, by Woodrow Wilson, Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando from Italy. He actually ends up leaving in the middle. Part of the issue with Italy is they're looking for some of the land that they were promised. French Premier Georges Clemenceau, who was a much older man at this point in time. He's nearly 80, and he had been alive at the time of the Franco-Prussian War. So in particular, he is very concerned about an aggressive Germany. And then Prime Minister from Britain, David Lloyd George, his really big take is that he's looking to try to temper some of the power of France, although Britain really comes down often on the side of France. They both have a lot in common. They're both large kind of colonial powers. Britain doesn't want to give up its colonial enterprise, neither does France, so they share kind of that common need to stay as imperial powers. But at the same time, Britain doesn't really want to see France gain too much at the expense of Germany. So there's some interest in kind of maintaining some of that. Maybe they don't want to punish Germany so harshly as France does. They're trying to maintain essentially a balance of power. So that becomes important. And of course, Germany and Russia are not attending because Germany is not at all given a seat at the table, and Russia neither. They had already left the war and settled their land with Germany through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So we kind of can just see an image here of Lloyd George and Clemenceau here, Orlando here, and Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, to some degree, is a little bit of an outsider. He had initiated the interaction with the United States and the military as being a little bit separate from the Allies. So there's a separate organization for the U.S. Army. They kind of come in almost as like an associate type of ally, so not completely on board, and that gave Wilson some unique footing. When the end of the war and the armistice came, the United States pitched the 14 points, and Germany essentially agreed to the armistice on the basis of the 14 points. So everything that Germany signed up for is related to the 14 points. And that way, when the Treaty of Versailles actually happens, Germany is kind of shocked by the essence of the Treaty of Versailles, and Woodrow Wilson is kind of seen a little bit differently by David Lloyd George and Clemenceau. There's some interest in what Wilson's trying to do, but they see him as arrogant, difficult to compromise with, not understanding their issues, which are really significant to them because they're in Germany's backyard. So the United States is kind of a little bit of an outsider. And Wilson has kind of an interesting personality that makes him challenging to get along with. Britain and France, of course, are looking to weaken Germany, France more so than Britain. And again, France really wants Germany to accept full blame, pay reparations, and basically lose all of their overseas colonies. Woodrow Wilson is kind of on the other side. He's a little concerned about really harsh reparations for Germany. And, Wilson kind of keeps launching into the 14 points. So for some reason or other, the PowerPoint itself is like off the screen. But I'm just going to note a couple of things about the 14 points. There's, of course, 14 of them. The first 5 of them are really all about trying to eliminate the causes of World War I. So the first 5 are like, what can we do to basically make sure that the world is a place safe for democracy and that there's peace and no war. So no more secret treaties, freedom of the seas, no more imperialism, reducing arms. All of those efforts would kind of make a more peaceful world. So not too different than some of the things that maybe our modern day UN is trying to accomplish. Some ideas like tonight is the conference between President Trump and the leader of North Korea. Perhaps there's some efforts to try to use diplomacy as a way to try to kind of reduce arms and things like that. So not too foreign to us as an idea of trying to create peace. The next section of the 14 points is really all about that concept of self-determination and political land boundaries. So some very specific things. Wilson does kind of suggest Alsace and Lorraine go back to France, readjustment of Italy's frontiers along lines of Italian nationality. So Wilson's kind of ideology that drives these political boundaries and these new states come really from the perspective of national and ethnic lines. And on paper, that looks very doable, and the kind of idea is in the 14 points. In reality, the challenge of doing this becomes very, very difficult. So the last of these points, number 13, establish of an independent Poland with free and secure access to the sea. That is something that actually happens. It's one of the 14 points that happens. We get an independent Poland. They actually do get secure access to the sea through the free city of Danzig, but ultimately the groups of people who are kind of carved out in this political entity that becomes Poland, for the most part, lots of people are Polish-speaking and Polish national identity, but there's also a lot of Germans and a lot of Russians. So every single one of these self-determined entities becomes kind of its unique hodgepodge of groups. And in some cases, these groups aren't going to necessarily easily get on with each other. And of course, the very last point is going to be the League of Nations. And Wilson kind of looks at all these other things can happen, but if there's ever a problem, like people disagree about the political boundaries, and maybe 15 years from now, there's going to be some decision making that some groups of people will do to see if they're going to be independent or not. All of those types of decisions could be made best by the groups of people affected and also through the capacity of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations is like this international forum. So on the pro side, it gives all of the countries a space to actually have conversations and solve problems. The problem with the League of Nations is that it's not given any power to really have anything binding. So there's really no ability for the League of Nations to have binding sanctions or anything like that unless all the countries in the League of Nations decide that collectively they're going to do that. So the biggest challenge with the League of Nations is it depends on collective security, in that, countries have to kind of agree to agree and that they're going to initiate certain actions as a group. So kind of like today's modern UN that has a Security Council, it becomes very difficult to just get even 5 permanent powers on the U.S. Security Council, able to agree, let alone all the members of the Security Council, let alone all the members of the United Nations. So even though the UN is a different body than the League of Nations, they kind of share that idea of collective security kind of being the driving force. And if countries could use their kind of common ground to solve problems, that could be very beneficial. But in a lot of cases, national sovereignty and national agendas, just makes it really hard for that to happen in reality. But there's hope, right, for the League of Nations to kind of support countries in the future. And in reality, again, this becomes challenging because countries that find themselves being aggressive, say, for example, Japan in the 1930s will invade Manchuria, and then China, and the League of Nations will wish to act. Japan's solution is to quit the League of Nations. So it doesn't necessarily become this really problem-solving entity that has a great deal of power. Britain and France disagree with a lot of the points of the 14 points, so clearly they're not going to get rid of their colonial entities and things like that. And so Wilson is kind of forced to compromise, and this process happens over the course of 6 months. It is not an easy process. Wilson goes back to the U.S. at one point. There's an election, a congressional election, where Democratic members of Congress are replaced by Republican members of Congress. So at home, Wilson faces a much tougher crowd in order to be liked. There's lots of people who become less enchanted with Wilson. He had some of the Espionage Act and some of those things, so some of his progressive or Democratic followers kind of drop him, and Republicans start to gain more ground. This also leads to some challenges abroad, too. He has a harder time trying to hold on to all the tenets of the 14 points. The basic things that happen in the Treaty of Versailles. So I'm just going to note a few of these things. The first one is the League of Nations. So there are a few things in the 14 points that actually do come to fruition. Probably the most significant one, and the one that was most important to Wilson, is is the League of Nations. So this is this international peace organization. It also does even have an international court attached to it. Of course, Germany is excluded, and for some time, Russia is excluded. The United States also never joins the League of Nations because the United States will never ratify the Treaty of Versailles. So the League of Nations is one of the things in the Treaty of Versailles. The territorial losses that Germany faces. Because the Treaty of Versailles is really focused on Germany, it really outlines specifically what territorial losses Germany will receive. And we can spend a couple minutes looking at the map, but Germany will return Alsace and Lorraine to France. The French border does get extended all the way to the Rhine River. Germany also will see that France and Germany kind of have a buffer zone, so the Rhineland becomes not only demilitarized but slightly occupied by the Allies. So there kind of is this territory that's Allied occupied between France and Germany, sort of to protect France. France also builds fortifications under the ground along its border with Germany. So there's lots of efforts on France's part to ensure that Germany isn't going to, engage in the Schlieffen Plan anymore. Germany also has to surrender all of its overseas colonies. So in addition to the Shandong province in China, there's also colonies in the Pacific. So like the Marshall Islands, for example. There's also 4 different colonies that Germany had in Africa, including Tanganyika. There's which is like modern day Tanzania. That area is also put under mandate. Most of the German colonies do get acquired by the imperial power. So these are not places that develop independently. Germany also has to reduce its arms and reduce its military. France is most interested in trying to decrease the German army. We'll see, and I can kind of put it up here. I think it's up here. The German army is going to be, there it is, reduced to 100,000 troops, 6 warships, no submarines, and they're not allowed to manufacture any war equipment. So they can't import any weapons, any type of war material. They're not allowed to build or buy submarines or have any airplanes built. They can't have an air force. They essentially don't have a navy. And all of these military restrictions are very, very restrictive. It's not really until 1936 that we see Adolf Hitler violate the Treaty of Versailles by militarizing the Rhineland. And the probably biggest issue for the people of Germany is the war guilt clause. The sole responsibility for the war is placed on Germany's shoulders. This is seen as kind of like a violation of the nation's honor, and something that the people of Germany not only blame the Western powers for, but also their own new government. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction within Germany at the new Weimar Republic because this government that had replaced the Kaiser, that's seemingly going to take Germany in like a new direction, is problematic to a lot of Germans because they've also signed this dictate of the Treaty of Versailles. So it becomes very, very much like kind of a turning point for lots of different, fractious groups that are going to seek political power in Germany. So this is competing political plans that start to develop and a lot of dissatisfaction. And of course, one of the biggest issues that we know is that Germany is going to be forced to pay reparations. And the reparations become a very, very kind of large-scale bill. It's actually the amount is decided a few years after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The amount that they're forced to pay is somewhere in the upwards of $36 billion, and ultimately they are told to pay this over 30 years. They pay nowhere near that amount, much less than $10 billion, and there are various points where they're not able to pay, and France actually takes hold of some of the industrial capacity in the Ruhr Valley. So there are efforts between France and Germany to get Germany to pay, but it does do tremendous damage to the economy of Germany. At least a lot of historians argue that, and there is kind of a way in which the United States gets involved in helping to repackage some of the Treaty of Versailles, particular to the reparations. And so lots of U.S. banks get involved in loaning money to Germany so that Germany can pay back Britain and France, so that Britain and France can pay back the debt to U.S. companies or banks. So there's all of this debt and kind of money that circulates, between places, the United States, Germany, and the Allied powers, and each has an interest in ensuring that that circle of funds continues. Okay, so then very lastly, we'll just kind of look at the map. And this video is going to cut off in a second. I have a kind of a way of talking way too long. So I am going to stop for a second and then just reintroduce just this one slide. And this